Remember that I squared is a negative 1, and I to the third is a negative I. So if I multiply a negative 1 by a negative I, the negatives cancel out, the 1 just drops, so it would be I. Answer is B. Remember that I to the fourth is 1, I to the third is negative I to the sixth is negative 1. So if I multiply all this together, these negatives cancel out, the 1 just drops, should be I. Answer is A. Three I's is I to the third, so that's negative I. Answer is C. You have I squared, that's a negative 1. These two i's multiplied together is I squared, that's also a negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is just 1. And now you have I to the third, which is a negative I. So the answer should be, yeah, the answer should be A, and I had it written down as being D, which is not right. So we'll figure out who had A and write it down. Pick a number from 1 to 20 and drop it off. Winning numbers today are 3, 6, 10, 12, and 15. Homework check, bring it on up here. We had 6 out of 9, which would be 67%. Here are the answers. Number 1 is I, looking a little blurry. 1 is I. 2 is 1. 3 is negative 1. 4 is I. 5 is negative I. 6 is negative 1. 7 is 1. Actually, that should be a negative 1. 7 is a negative 1. Negative 1 times 1 would be negative 1. 8 is negative 1. 9 is negative 1. 10 is I. To simplify complex numbers, example 1. You have 4 over I. And a rule that's in place is that you cannot have a complex number on the bottom, an imaginary number on the bottom. To get rid of that number, you have to multiply the top and the bottom by something to get rid of it. And in this case, if you have an I, you could multiply the top and the bottom by an I. I over I doesn't change the value, it's just 1, but it will help simplify it. If I multiply the top and the bottom by I get 4I over I squared. What is I squared? I squared is what? Negative 1. So 4I over negative 1 turns out to be a negative 4I. We multiplied the top and the bottom by I so that we could make this an I squared, which would cancel out to a negative 1, and then divide the top by negative 1 to get negative 4I. Here's example 2. 3 over 2I. Now just because you have a 2 on the bottom doesn't mean you have to multiply the top and the bottom by 2I. You still only have to multiply by I on the top and the bottom. So that'll give you a 3I on top and a 2i squared on the bottom. Now, of course, I squared is -1, so that would give me a -2 on the bottom. But don't leave a negative sign on the bottom. If you have a positive on top and a negative on the bottom, move that negative sign directly to the left of the fraction bar and just make the whole fraction negative. So a -3i over 2 is a better version than 3 over 2i. Alright, on this problem you have an I on the bottom, so we want to make it an even power of I. So multiply the top and the bottom by I to get 6i over 8i squared. The I squared on the bottom changes to -1. So that gives me a -8 on the bottom. But I have 6 over 8 that can reduce. If you cut those in half, it's 3i over -4. And move your negative sign directly out to the left. If we have 4 over, we'll make it 2i to the third. You have an even, or not an even, but an odd power of I on the bottom. I want to make that I to the what power. What's my goal? Instead of I to the third, I want I to the what? I to the fourth. So multiply the top and the bottom by I to get 4i over 2i to the fourth. And then on the bottom, that I to the fourth just goes to 1. So you would have 4i over 2, and 4 over 2 cancels to 2. Now if you want to, you can do this. And we don't even have to work these all the way out. Let's say I had I to the first on the bottom. Instead of making it I squared, I could do this. I could multiply the top and the bottom by I to the third and make it 3i to the third over I to the fourth. What's I to the fourth? Yeah, I to the fourth is 1, so it's just 3i to the third over 1, so it cancels out. But you simplify the 3i to the third, though, and that would be a -3i, because this goes to -I, and that sign would just come out front. If I had 4 over 3i to the fifth, what am I going to make that I to the fifth? To 6. So if I go I to the first over I to the first, I get 4i over 3i to the sixth. I to the sixth is what? -1. So that would end up being a -3 on the bottom. So your answer is a -4i over 3. Well, multiply the top and the bottom by I to get 10i over 15i squared, and that would be 10i over 15 times a -1, which is a -15. But you can simplify the 10 over 15 to 2 over -3 and just make it a -2. Whoops, -2i over 3. Three times 2 is 6, and I times I is I squared. I squared is -1, so 6 times -1 is A, -6. Four times 3 times 2 is 24, and the 3 i's is I to the third. Remember, I to the third is -I, so that would make it -24i. 2 times 3 is 6, times 2 is 12, and all of these exponents add up to be 5. You know I to the fourth is 1, so it just drops out, and you have one I left, so it would be B, 12I. Two times 3 is 6, and I, and I is I to the fourth. I to the fourth is 1, so 6 times 1 is 6, would be C. Example 3. 3i squared over 9i to the fifth. Now, don't multiply anything on the top and the bottom by any kind of I yet, because when you have i's on the top and the bottom, you can simplify that first. And while you're at it, you can simplify the 3 over 9 to start with. 3 over 9 is 1 over 3. Don't write a 1 on top yet, unless you have to. I to the second over I to the fifth, the exponents subtract. Start with the large exponent, which is 5, subtract the smaller one, 2, and you get 3, so that would be I to the third. But that I to the third goes where the bigger exponent was, so it's on the bottom. Subtract the exponents, large minus small, and put the result where the largest one was at. So in this case it was the bottom. So now we have nothing on top, so we do have to write a 1 after all on the top. If we have an I to the third there, we can make that an I to the fourth now by multiplying the top and the bottom by I and getting I over 3i to the fourth. 3i to the fourth is 1, so it just cancels out, and you're left with I over 3. Here is the same problem, except I'm going to do it differently. If you like this way better, you can use it. How about we start off by multiplying the top and the bottom by I, and then make it 3i to the third over 9i to the sixth. So if I do that, I end up with a 3i to the third on top, and on the bottom, I to the sixth is negative 1. So I would have 3i to the third over negative 9. I could reduce my 3 over 9 and just be left with I to the third over negative 3. But I still have I to the third on top. And remember, I to the third is a negative I, and that's over negative 3. So the negative signs would cancel out, and I still arrive at the same answer. So you can decide if you want to do it that way, multiply before simplifying, or the other way we just did before this. Example number 4. So I have 6i squared on top and 3i to the sixth on the bottom. Somebody give me a starting point. Is there anything I can do? It doesn't matter what it is. Tell me what you think I could do.
Divide both of them.
6 and 3?
Yeah.
Okay, we can do that.
Do you have to divide them by 2, or do you have to just go 6 divided by 3?
Well, 3 is the only number that would go into 6 and 3, so you'd have to divide by 3 to get a 2 on top, and you just have a 1 on the bottom, so we're left with I to the sixth on the bottom. We can do that first. What's another thing I can do now?
Subtract the larger number by the smaller.
Yeah, we can subtract the exponents. You have the largest, 6, minus the smallest, 2. 6 minus 2 would be 4.
And then put that on the top.
It would be on the bottom because that's where the largest exponent was. Wherever the larger number was, that's where the result will go. So you have I to the sixth. You want 6 minus 2. It's I to the fourth, and the 6 was larger, so the I to the fourth goes on the bottom. What can I simplify next?
I to the fourth is 1.
Yeah, I to the fourth is 1,
And that's 2.
and the final answer is 2. for this problem, we can do this. I to the 4th is 1. It cancels out. And I to the 6th is negative 1, so it gives me a negative 8 on the bottom. So there's no need to multiply by i's. And if you simplify this, you'll have 3 over 2, a negative 3 over 2.